All right, Chairman, you should be able to start now. I apologize.
Thank you, Dana. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and the Environment Subcommittee on Appropriations briefing on transit reform in Maryland, new models for accountability, stability, and equity. As members of the subcommittee know, I've personally spent a lot of time looking at transit agencies, and the thing I've learned is that if you've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency. All of them are structured differently, governed differently, funded differently. But that doesn't mean there aren't things we can learn from other models to figure out how to do things differently or better. The Maryland Transit Administration is a bit of an amalgamation. It started as sort of a statewide planning agency. It took over local bus and subway service in Baltimore City, expanded to take on the commuter rail operations, the now really well-named Market Commuter Rail Service. It built a light rail system in Baltimore City and is now overseeing construction of a light rail line off and on in the DC suburbs. So it has both a statewide role and a role in many of our communities, as well as a very specific role in the Baltimore region. And I know there are many frustrations that people all over the state can have with MTA, but it's particularly pronounced in the city and the surrounding areas where they really rely on MTA for their local service, the way I rely on Ride-On and WMATA in my area. We make a significant investment of our state taxpayer dollars in MTA, almost $1 billion a year in operating, $600 million a year in capital, but the needs are great and the demand is great. Last year, the House of Delegates passed the Transit Safety and Investment Act to try to deal with some of our capital backlog, and we hope to work with our partners in the Senate to continue to advance those issues this year, but there are significant questions about funding, service, safety, reliability, all those things that riders of the system care about. And I'll also, as always, mention that it's not only riders of the system that benefit from transit. Every transit rider on a bus or a rail car is one less person in a single occupancy vehicle creating traffic backups. And that's to say nothing of the economic and environmental benefits of our transit investment. We have a lot of guests today. We're joined by two of our colleagues from the Senate, Senator Corey McRae, who chairs our equivalent subcommittee over there, and Senator Edwards. We're also joined by our full committee chair. Before I introduce our panelists, let me turn it over to Chair McIntosh for any opening comments. You're on mute, Madam Chair.
I have a 6-month-old, actually about a 7-month-old black lab puppy in this house. So I put myself on mute all the time, as you will find out. But anyway, I do want to welcome everyone. This is a very important briefing today that we're going to undertake. We have discovered and we know that during the pandemic, one of the kind of glaring stories, if you will, or facts that emerged out of the pandemic was to look at ridership across the state in our MTA, our transit, our WMATA. And yes, of course, when people were asked to stay at home, not go into their offices, of course, ridership dropped. It dropped tremendously. But there was one exception to that, and that was Baltimore City bus service in particular. The ridership didn't drop as much because we found out what we in Baltimore have known for a long time, that that ridership is very transit dependent. It's the group of riders that don't have a car. It's the group of riders that are essential workers that go to our hospitals, in particular in the Baltimore region, and have been the frontline folks during this pandemic. So it was an interesting picture that emerged that I think is very important. It is true that the entire state needs good transit and good transit options and good roads. And we have also seen, and the chair of this subcommittee and vice chair and I have talked repeatedly about the fact that we need to increase in some way or look at ways to increase the amount of money that's going into our transportation trust fund to meet these needs. So I look forward to this briefing as a part of a larger picture of the needs in Maryland. And I'm very happy to have our Senate counterparts, by the way, join us today. So thank you very much for setting this up, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chair McCray, I'm going to do something dangerous and recognize the Senate. Anything you want to add up front?
First, just thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Chair. I'm honored to be joined by Chairwoman Maggie McIntosh also. But I just want to make sure that I once again recognize Senator Edwards, my colleague from the Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment. And you also may get a couple more of my colleagues that join us throughout this time. I won't belabor. I think that the Chairman, Chairman Corman, stated great words in reference to the challenges that we face. I think that Chairwoman McIntosh very much honed in on some of the immediate and increasing needs that happen within the communities that we represent. She talked about the food insecurities and how some of our neighborhoods don't have supermarkets, but they use our public transits just to get the basic needs of food. She talked about the prescription drugs that our seniors may need during this time, our young people in a unique situation that still catch our mass transit administration. And also she talked about the essential workers. This is a very, very important mode of transportation. And I'm glad that the House is stepping up and leading on this effort and making sure that we can all get versed and educated on the opportunities that's out there for our MTA. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Chair McCray. I'll introduce our speakers, and I recommend that we just go through each speaker as a panel, and then we can take questions at the end if that works for our panelists. Our first speaker is going to be Brian O'Malley, President and CEO of Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. Certainly no stranger to members of this committee for his advocacy. Our second speaker will be Michael Kelly, the Executive Director of the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. And I should note, I believe the BMC is undergoing their own review right now of MTA's governance. The next speaker will be Paul Lewis, Vice President of Policy and Finance for the Eno Center for Transportation. And he's joined by Brianne Eby, I apologize if I'm butchering your name, Senior Policy Analyst for the Eno Center for Transportation. They recently released Transit Reform for Maryland, New Models for Accountability, Stability, and Equity, a report about this topic. Let me also just give a quick shout out to our colleague Delegate Bridges on the subcommittee, who's done a lot of work on this topic in his both in his years in the General Assembly and I know prior to that as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Brian to kick us off. Brian.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for, I know there's a lot of demands on your time. Thank you for taking this issue seriously and giving it time on your agenda. As Chair Corman said, I am Brian O'Malley. I'm the President and CEO of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. We're a small nonprofit based in Baltimore. And I think my contribution to today's discussion is to frame for you why we've decided it's a priority to take a hard look at reforming the way public transportation is governed and paid for in the greater Baltimore region. We were supportive of Delegate Bridges and Senator Carter's bill to take a look at this. We've since commissioned our own study that you're going to hear from the authors on. We did that jointly with the Greater Washington Partnership. And that's not a decision we took lightly. That's a cost and an investment of our time and resources to do that. And so I want to speak to why we thought it was important. The Central Maryland Transportation Alliance is, our mission is to improve transportation options for the people and employers of the greater Baltimore region. And we feel that the way we pay for and the way we govern public transportation in the greater Baltimore region is not producing good results. And as evidence of that, I'll cite a few things. One is that we have not added new capacity to the region's transit network since 1997, when the Maryland Transit Administration went back and double-tracked the light rail. They had built it single track at first to get it done in time to keep Camden Yards, or keep the Orioles in the area and make the Camden Yards project work. And they went back and double-tracked it in 97 and added a couple extensions. Since that time, regions across the country have invested aggressively in adding bus rapid transit, light rail, et cetera. And we have not. We've stood pat. Another key reason is that people in our region who are trying to get to jobs, to schools, I'll remind you that in Baltimore City, middle school and high school students get an MTA pass. They don't get a yellow bus, they get a pass to ride the MTA. So people going to jobs and schools, medical appointments, other destinations are coping with buses and trains that break down more often than in peer transit systems in the US. That's based on Federal Transit Administration data. Last year, we saw that our buses broke down the 8th most in the country, but the most among the MTA's own peer agencies that it has designed for evaluating its performance. For light rail, we're number one, the most breakdowns per 100,000 miles of revenue service in the country for any light rail system. For metro subway, number one, the worst in the country. For commuter rail, we're fourth worst in the country for commuter rail. That's the MARC system that serves 9 counties in Maryland. So those are high rankings on a measure where we don't want to be ranked highly. We've got a lot of disruption built into the system. And consistently, when you see surveys or polls, people who use, when they decide how they're going to travel, reliability is the number one or up there, within the top 3 issues for people, higher than cost in the most recent poll I saw. The system has to be reliable or it's a deal breaker for many people deciding how to commute. And our system simply isn't reliable enough. In the 5 years prior to the pandemic, of course, the pandemic has been a huge disruptor, but in the 5 years prior to the pandemic, MTA ridership fell 20%. That is the wrong direction. We need to be making public transportation a more attractive option for folks, but they're responding to that lack of investment and that lack of reliability and choosing other modes. At the same time, after it fell for 6 consecutive years. In 2014, vehicle miles traveled per capita this is statewide, vehicle miles traveled per capita in Maryland began to climb. And it climbed faster than it had fallen. And so by 2018, we had exceeded our previous high. That's also the wrong direction. We need to be reducing our emissions, and we need to be reducing the amount of time that people have to spend in cars to get to work and accomplish their other errands. But instead, we're going in the wrong direction. And the New York Times had a great report about a year ago about carbon emissions. Transportation, I'm sure this committee is aware that transportation is the #1 source of carbon emissions in both Maryland and the United States. And in the greater Baltimore region, carbon emissions per capita was continuing to grow, where other places in the country had started to arrest that growth and even shrink it. I'm going to add 2 shameless plug here, but my organization does a transportation report card, and we issued a 2020 update to it yesterday. That's something we created in 2015, and it was designed to be updated every 2 to 3 years. I say every 2 to 3 years because it's based on 12 external data points that we don't control. Things like the US Census or the American Society of Civil Engineers, some university work, the US EPA, et cetera. Those are 12 data points that we use as a measuring stick, that we apply the same measuring stick over time and we see if we're getting better. And the point of doing that was to move conversations about transportation beyond just griping about, traffic is annoying, to really capturing how transportation affects our lives and our communities. And so we believe these 12 indicators do that. Unfortunately, the average grade across those 12 indicators remains a D. It was a D in 2015, and we got a D again this time. And that's something that is not acceptable. We need to demand excellence. We need to be improving. And that's based on things like air pollution and access to jobs, critical fundamental things to the health of people, the health of our communities, and the quality of life. And we've got to do better. during the pandemic, we've seen, people often say, it's almost a cliche now to say that the pandemic has laid bare the inequities that already existed. And that's certainly been true in transportation. We know that in Baltimore, people rely on public transportation to get to work. But what we saw during the pandemic was that while ridership did fall, it didn't fall by as much in the Baltimore region as it did nationwide. Many people continue to rely on public transportation. And there was a study that came out in the spring about essential workers, and I think it used the Pennsylvania definition of essential workers. And it found that of the people who commute primarily by public transportation in Baltimore, 40% of them are essential workers. They meet that definition from Pennsylvania. And so our healthcare workers, our food distribution workers, and in grocery stores continue to rely on that service to get to and from the job. And so it's going to be critical both for getting through this pandemic and our economic recovery. So that brings me to reform. The idea has been kicked around casually for years, but we feel it's time for thought leaders and decision makers in Maryland to give serious attention to the idea of replacing the top-down model we have for governing and financing public transportation with more local and regional control. There are two key advantages in that kind of reform. One is giving more local control and accountability. And two is the ability to raise more funds for more and improved transit service. Even in this tough year of 2020, we've seen that 82% of ballot initiatives around the country to invest more in transit passed. And that's in all kinds of states. A big one just on election day passed in Austin, Texas. But it's happening 82% of the time. Voters are saying, yes, we want to be taxed more to invest more in our transportation because we see how that will have us come out better in the end. We were looking back at a 2015 report by who you're going to hear from in a few minutes, and Transit Center that looked at the way governance of transportation systems affects maintenance and performance problems. And they found that the type of governance is a major cause of transit maintenance and performance problems. And they produced a set of case studies in that report. The report was titled "Getting to the Root of It: The Role of Governance in Regional Transit." We've seen in 2019, just a little over a year ago, the MTA produced a capital needs inventory. That came out of the Maryland Metro Transit Funding Act that you were a co-sponsor of, Chair Corman. And that was based on making sure that Maryland contributed to meeting WMATA's capital needs. But it showed a gap that WMATA had a capital needs inventory. So it had a good handle on what the state of its assets are. And MTA lacked that. And so the General Assembly required that. MTA produced an excellent document that came out in July of 2019, and it showed a $2 billion gap between what MDOT has programmed over the next 10 years and what MTA's needs are to run a safe and reliable service. That says nothing about expanding, that's just maintaining and operating a safe and reliable system, a $2 billion gap. So we think it's time to look at reform. We're excited that the BRTB has taken this up, and we're proud to offer what Brianne and Paul are going to present as ENO's findings on a serious hard look at this, and we hope it informs your considerations and discussions about this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Kelly.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Like Delegate McIntosh can relate, I have a 5-year-old human boy in the house who also makes me go on mute a lot. So I have a slide presentation if people want to set that up. But I'll introduce myself. My name is Mike Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, the Council of Governments and host agency of the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Baltimore region. And For folks who are not familiar with councils and MPOs, essentially we work with the local jurisdictions, Baltimore City and 6 surrounding jurisdictions, to largely help program their share of federal transportation dollars. That is done on the Metropolitan Planning Organization side. Our counterpart in the Washington region is the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. Other areas BMC gets involved in are housing, workforce policy, all sorts of other things the counties may want to cooperate on. But today I'm going to present an outline of the transit funding and governance study that we are just beginning to undertake next week. Next slide, please. First 2 slides are just quick descriptions of what BMC does. And again, this is the Council of Governments. I will note that our membership includes, in addition to the elected executives of our jurisdictions, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and Governor have appointees. And Delegate Bridges is the appointee on the House side. Senator Ferguson sits on our board on behalf of the Senate, and Tom Sadowski with the University of Maryland system is the governor's appointee. Next slide, please. On the BRTB side, the Baltimore Regional Transportation Board is the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the transportation planning organization that is federally designated for our region. And BMC provides staff and office space for this board. The membership is almost identical as that of the BMC board. And the key difference is that they are part of the local, state, regional, and national transportation planning process. So one of the projects that we've undertaken, next slide, please, is a study of, oh, actually, I apologize. Before we go, this is the map of jurisdictions we represent. About 3 years ago, we added Queen Anne's County. There's enough people who travel over the bridge for work and education on a daily basis that Queen Anne's is now part of the area we plan for. So it's a pretty geographically and otherwise diverse region and a large chunk of the state. Next slide, please, and then we can get into the project. So we've started, as Brian mentioned, there have been casual conversations about the structure of MTA, how these decisions are made in the region, largely around the disconnect between a state-run transit agency and the local governments and their residents who really need to interact with transit on a daily basis. And there's been all sorts of variations of this conversation, and it's one that at BMC we started to formalize beginning in 2018. So in 2019, Delegate Bridges put in a bill for a relatively small transportation authority study. The legislation passed, but MDOT did not award the funding to BMC to do the study. It was for, I believe, $40,000. So not it would have been the primer for the study that we're beginning now. Last fall, we began this effort in earnest, or last spring in February. We released our initial budget for our Unified Planning Work Program. That's the BRTB's annual budget. In May, that was adopted with the following project included. In August, we issued an RFP, and I'm going to go through the scope of work in that RFP next. And on Tuesday at the BRTB meeting, we will have our first meeting with our consultant. This project is scheduled to be completed by June 30th, by the end of the fiscal year. So we're really hoping to get a lot done over the next 6 months and come out with a really substantive and tangible product that can help drive a very informed conversation on this issue moving forward. Next slide. So I'll quickly go through the scope. And the numbers here are essentially the chapters that the BRTB anticipates will be in the final product. So we're going to look at our study purpose and approach. We're going to work with our consultant, with the board itself and stakeholders to really determine and refine what that is. We're going to look at the history of MDOT, MTA, and our locally operated transit systems. We want to catalog the types of service provided, how that's changed over time, look at ridership trends, look at revenue. And you can tell I typed this from the typos as opposed to the pretty slides I had before. But we will look at revenue and revenue, as well as non-revenue service, and look at it at the regional and jurisdictional level. MTA's core service area, bus-wise, covers Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Northern Anne Arundel County. There's other services that reach into the other jurisdictions, and we're going to take all that into account. We're going to look at the current structure, the operating and capital processes, about how these funds are allocated and determined, the State Transportation Trust Fund, which is a real asset to the state and allows us to do some really successful transportation planning and operation. We're going to talk about the role of the General Assembly and the BRTB in this process in terms of how the state makes transportation decisions. Anticipating one of the questions will be, how is the General Assembly going to be included in our study? I think that's where we're lucky to have designees from the Speaker and the President. I'm going to defer to Delegate Bridges and Senator Ferguson to sort of help us make sure we're including all the right voices in the legislature as we do this. We're also going to look at the locally operated transit service decision-making process. There are sort of county-run agencies in almost every jurisdiction that manage smaller services that interact with MTA. And as much as we're going to look at the big picture and multi-billion-dollar numbers that go into running MTA, we also want to consider these small local services that really provide critical workforce, elder, and other service for our jurisdiction. The next slide, please. We're going to do a financial review. We're going to dig into MTA's finances. And I should say that MDOT sits on the board of the BRTB. They're a required partner. And that MDOT was on board with the development of this scope of work. We have a rotating transit agency on the board. This year, I believe it is going to be the Annapolis Area Transit Agency, but MTA is certainly going to be there as well. So we're going to look into historic and current budgets. We're going to talk about revenue. We're going to talk about the capital needs inventory that Brian mentioned, the $2 billion gap in our capital needs. And we're going to look at the cost projections for the regionally completed regional transit plan. And hopefully refine some of the lines outlined there to talk about the ones that will really be high priority for the region moving forward. Also important is looking at peer agencies. The way Maryland operates is fairly unique. Nationally, there are not a lot of state-run transit agencies running transit in large metro areas. Typically, state-run transit is found in some of the big box states, Kansas, the Dakotas, where you don't have these dense urban areas. And we'll talk about what it means for the state to essentially be running Baltimore's transit and dig into the pros and cons of that. With that, we'll talk about project selection process. A sticking point for years has been the lack of a seat at the table that local jurisdictions have in determining the projects that come to their jurisdictions. We will look at equity and social justice considerations. That's a core part of what BRTB does typically, and it will obviously need to be a core part of this project. And then look at, in terms of how we review, it's not just looking at the agencies themselves, but we want to look at how these regions operate and what the interaction is between regional, state, local transit operations. So we're going to try and cast a wide net, try and identify peer regions that we think align with our system, with our population and our specific needs, and see what we can learn from those. Next slide, please. Looking at a review of transit funding measures, Brian mentioned one that just passed in Austin. As many transit funding measures are on ballots every year. They don't all pass, and we want to dig into what makes these funding measures successful, what are some of the drawbacks. We just led a trip last year, my agency, to Nashville. We brought 70 regional leaders down there. And one of the conversations we had was about a planned transit network that Nashville put forward that ultimately failed because of a funding referendum that was unsuccessful. So we want to dig in to lay out some of the ins and outs of how those operate and try and identify models that could be applicable to our region. Options for governance and funding, this will be a critical section. We are asking the consultant to identify at least 4 options for these models. I do not anticipate that our report is going to put forward one over the others. The board at this point does not think that's our role. I think, again, when I started this, I said we wanted to put out a product that can lead to a really informed conversation. And I think we will certainly have opinions along the way, and the elected officials who sit in our board will certainly voice opinions afterwards. But I think for our document, we really need to have a data-driven, analytical approach that presents realistic options that can drive a conversation in the future. The General Assembly needs to be there, the administration needs to be there, local governments need to be there, and citizens need to be there. So I'm hoping that we can put forward a document that really frames an informed conversation and helps us all make the right decision moving forward. I believe that's all my slides, but we can check on the next one. Yeah, there's my contact information, so I'm certainly happy to talk to anyone with specific questions afterwards, and look forward to being part of the conversation after the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Keller. We'll now turn to our friends at the Eno Center, Mr. Lewis and Ms. Ebby.
Great, thank you. So I'm actually going to kick off our discussion today, and we have some slides as well. All right, there we go. So first of all, thank you very much to Chairman Corman, and thanks to the entire subcommittee for hosting us today. My name is Brianne Eby. You got the pronunciation right at the top. Thanks for that. And I'm a senior policy analyst at Eno, and I'm joined with, by Paul Lewis, who's our vice president of policy at Eno. Go ahead and shift to the next slide, please. So we're with the Eno Center for Transportation, which was founded in 1921, so just about 100 years ago, as the Eno Foundation for Highway Traffic Regulation by William Phelps Eno. And today we're a transportation policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. And we do both research and analysis on all modes of transportation, all levels of government, really any transportation policy topic. And we also conduct professional development trainings for people that are employed in the transportation industry. Next slide, please. So over the last, roughly 6 or 7 years, Eno has conducted scans of transit governance across the country and looking, really at best practices for governance of transit systems in all kinds of places. And I think Brian actually alluded earlier to our previous study, Getting to the Root of It, which was in many ways a good precursor to this study. But we've also done, so that was a scan of many places across the country. We've also done, local scans here in the District of Columbia. And across all of these reports, the underlying theme is that it's important to study governance because the way that transit is governed ultimately determines, how well transit services respond to the communities or to the region's needs. It can influence things like capital investments in the system, the operations and maintenance of the system, all kinds of factors that inform the everyday quality of how the system meets people's needs. And since populations change over time, I think it's important to periodically evaluate whether the regions or communities' needs are being met. And so that's kind of the underlying theme for all of this work. For this report, as mentioned previously, we partnered with the Greater Washington Partnership and the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance to look at transit governance in the Central Maryland region. And as Brian, I think, mentioned, a lot of the reason that we're doing this is because we understand that there haven't been capital investments in recent years. There is considerable geographic and racial inequities in the way that transit is delivered. And so that's kind of the underlying purpose of this study. Next slide, please. So in terms of our research scope and what we were trying to get out of this study, so we first wanted to understand what is the current way that transit operates in the region, what's lacking, and then we looked at how does that compare to peer regions across the country. So this actually, I'll be curious to see what comes out of the BMC study, in terms of peer analysis, because that's something that we got into as well with ours, and so I think, very synchronous in that regard. And then the final thing that we did with this study is to propose several options for reform. And I'd like to, just be clear at the top here that we didn't make recommendations. So we provide several options for governance and funding reform, but we're, ultimately the decision comes down to decision makers in the region and at the state level. We also did not perform a robust econometric analysis with this. So, rather we're providing a very high level analysis of some options for decision makers to consider in the region as you think critically about a path forward. And, ultimately, I think one of the big things that we came out of this study with is that the current arrangement makes it difficult to deliver long-term plans and to respond to regional needs. And so, for example, and I'll go into more detail on this in just a bit, the MTA has currently no board of directors, and local jurisdictions do not directly fund services. And so, more local representation might fundamentally change the way that transit operates in the region. Next slide, please. So in terms of our methodology, so we began by drawing from our existing research. Again, we've done considerable research on this topic in other regions in the past, so we drew from that. We drew from other literature or other research and literature that's been written on this topic, by other research institutions and academic institutions. We conducted interviews with stakeholders that are currently and previously involved in transit in the state and in the region. We conducted case studies for 3 peer regions. So we looked at the Boston transit delivery in Boston, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then Pittsburgh. And we chose those 3 regions because they're roughly comparable in size, but they also have considerable state involvement in the way that transit is delivered. But that state involvement is balanced by local representation as well. And then we came out of all of this research with several options for reform that we'll go into more detail on in just a bit. Next slide, please. So what makes transit governance so unique in the Central Maryland region? Next slide. So the first and primary thing that I alluded to earlier is that MTA does not have a board of directors. Rather, as you all know, it's embedded within the state DOT. And MDOT is responsible for most of the state's transportation functions. And as you can see in this chart, MTA is one of several other modal administrations. MTA delivers services statewide, including to the Baltimore region. Transit agencies that do not, or that do have boards, typically have a mix of state and local representation in those boards. And so the fact that there's not a board of directors means that there's not, as much of an opportunity for local input. There's no local oversight, thus, for the services. Next slide, please. So the primary source of funding for MTA services is, as you all know, the Transportation Trust Fund, and local governments don't directly contribute to the system. And so this is, I believe, the 2019 capital and operating budgets for the MTA. And as you can see here, there is no local contributions to the MTA's budget. And this is in contrast to peer regions. And I'd encourage you to take a look at our report and compare these charts to the budgets of the peer agencies that we look at. All 3 of which do have local funds contributed for capital and operating expenses. And this is unique when compared to not only the peers that we looked at, but peers around the country. We found that when looking at transit agencies, so of the 88 largest transit agencies in the country, most of them derive at least I think it's 95% of their non-federal subsidies from local sources. So once you remove that federal subsidy from transportation budgets for local agencies, most of the funding does come from federal sources. That's pretty striking that MTA is kind of uniquely not in that category compared to its peers. Next slide, please. I think this is my last one before I'll switch it over to Paul, but just want to reiterate, and I think somebody mentioned this earlier. So under the current governance structure, MTA is responsible for 3 very distinct roles. So it's it operates local and regional services in and around the Baltimore area. MTA provides commuter services throughout the entire state, and even into surrounding states. And MTA is also building a major capital project currently in the DC suburbs. And so these are 3 very different imperatives, and can mean that their responsibilities are kind of stretched thin between these 3 roles. With that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Paul.
Fantastic. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a couple minutes going through our key findings and then our recommendations, and hopefully this will be a good foundation for discussion. So when we're thinking about the future of governance in the Baltimore region, there's 5 areas that we think we should include in that discussion. One, the state should continue to play a role. Right now, all the funding for MTA comes from the state. It would be pretty much impossible for that funding to be replaced by local sources completely. And there is some benefit to having a state perspective involved in governance. But contrast that with our second finding is that local leaders need to have more direct involvement. Right now, as Brianne just mentioned, the state has complete authority over all decision-making, budgets, and whatnot at the agency. Related to that is our third one here is that the region needs consistency across political cycles. As it stands right now, a new governor and a new administration can come in and dramatically alter the direction and policy and funding objectives of the MTA, which has been problematic. And one of the things that came up in pretty much every interview that we talked to folks was the cancellation of the Red Line as kind of an example of how a huge capital project that spent a long time in development and planning can be disrupted so quickly. The fourth is about workforce, something that we always include in our studies and something that's always comes up is that labor should be involved in these discussions, should be protected during some kind of transition. They're a key constituency and an important part of the transit system and should be brought along in the process. And then the fifth one is related to the last slide that Brianne just discussed, something that Chairman Corman talked about was the kind of the difference between the MTA's roles in having a statewide services like commuter rail, commuter buses, Purple Line, and then local transit services within the Baltimore region. So we'll go to the next slide where we'll talk about the options that we recommend. So after a lot of deliberation, consideration, we came down to 3 options. These are all mutually exclusive. They all kind of represent a little bit of a range of kind of feasibility and effort that would be required from state and local leaders. Each one of them also represents, I think, a demonstrable benefit to what we have today. The first is probably the most straightforward and easiest because it retains the MTA structure and basically their mandate. But we would have in this option we would have the state authorized transit oversight boards. These would have limited powers to oversee and inform state level decision making. So they wouldn't have budget authority or kind of veto authority on major changes that the MTA wants to do. But they would be a body that would meet on a monthly basis, made up mostly of local officials focused on those key competencies that the MTA has. And the administrator of the MTA would be required to chair and steward these boards. So we would have a little bit of local input and consistency between administrations and in the planning process. The second option is installing a state level board of directors for the MTA. And this one is a little bit more effort, would certainly require a pretty significant change in how the MTA conducts its business. In kind of designing this, we took a couple examples from the Boston system for one, right? This is how the MBTA in Boston functions. There is a state level board of directors. All those board of directors are appointed by the governor, but they serve 4-year terms that are staggered. So when a new governor comes in, there is a few years before you start to see really turnover in the board. So there is some level of consistency. Those board of directors members have direct authority over budget and major decision making. We also, in this option, felt like there's some examples we could take from the Minneapolis case. Minneapolis is also a state-controlled agency receiving a lot of state funds, and the governor appoints all members of the board in that case. However, the board members must come from jurisdictions in the region, and those jurisdictions are drawn out by population. So the greater population density areas tend to have more representation, which is somewhat of a proxy for ridership of that system. And so again, borrowing from those 2 examples, installing a state level board that provides some consistency, provides some local representation, we think would certainly be an option. This would obviously require state legislation to move forward. The third option is the most dramatic departure from the status quo, where in this case we would split the MTA into and retain the current MTA structure, right? The MTA would continue to deliver statewide services like commuter rail and commuter bus services that go up beyond state borders. It would also be responsible for delivering big capital projects like the Purple Line in the DC suburbs. But the services and the staff that are responsible for transit in the Baltimore region. So this is the local bus, this is the light rail, this is the Metro Transit, this would be the Metro Subway, sorry. This would be spun off into a new entity that would be kind of independent. And so a couple components that go into that. First, from a governing board standpoint, we anticipate both local and state funds would be continuing to contribute to this. So then we would also see a shared governing responsibility from the board, and perhaps adopting a governance structure similar to what's done in Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, the transit agency sits within the Port Authority of Allegheny County, and the 11 board members that govern the Port Authority of Allegheny County, 5 of them come from the state government. The governor appoints few, the legislature appoints a few, and then the remaining 6 come from the local jurisdictions that appoint based roughly on ridership. So you have this kind of shared responsibility of both state and local decision makers. This third option would, however, require some new funding directly from the localities. Right now, it's completely funded by the state. Our recommendation is that we keep the state funds and perhaps set up a dedicated funding stream similar to what goes to WMATA, and then the localities would be responsible for contributing some portion of the operating and or capital budgets that can make that system happen. And so obviously that's a challenge. On the next slide, if we can advance to that, we have a back of the envelope analysis that we put together of funding. So, when this came up a lot, what does it actually mean to have local funding? What would it look like? So most peer regions have at least 20% of their funds come from local sources directly. So for the MTA, for the portion of the MTA that's focused on transit in the Baltimore region, that's about $140 million annually. We would, again, to reiterate, we would say this does not supplant state funds, but just kind of in addition to help reinvest into the system and to help make sure that there is a buy-in from the localities relative to their governance. Some regions like the Boston region does a local assessment. So in that region, every locality has to chip in to the system, and they are assessed a portion based on their population in relation to the region's population. And they, through their own local taxing streams, figure out how to pay that assessment. Another option could be local sales tax. Obviously, this would require state authorization. And in this case, we recognize that there is some challenges with that, particularly since the sales tax is a state-based tax, but we could envision something beyond the current 6% applied in the counties within the jurisdiction of this new agency. That could be somewhere on the range of a half cent to a full cent to total up to that $140 million annually. Budget could also come from something like local income taxes. They could use the budgets that they currently allocate to their local transit services, and those get absolved into this new agency. There's a lot of different options to explore, and Brianne and I are certainly not experts in Maryland tax policy, but wanted to just kind of present this to give, again, some order of magnitude numbers to the funding discussion that would particularly apply to the third option if we were to go down that road. So next slide, which is kind of our ending slide. Obviously, there's this is kind of our first cut at this. We're really excited that the BMC has launched another study that I think is going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these subjects. But This is transit reform is a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to be something that takes a lot of coalition building and time. But I think that it's something that could certainly benefit the state, certainly benefit the region. And we are excited to be part of that conversation. So with that, I'll stop, and I think we'll move into the discussion part.
Great. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Colleagues, just a reminder, use the raise hand function in the participants tab, and we'll start with Chair McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we could just have one comment, I guess maybe BMC comment on the $300,000 study. How can the study that's already taken place, the $50,000 study, complement or help with the study that you're conducting? And then I have a second question that I'll just get out the way. If any one of the groups can comment on the private sector stuff like the Maglev or other projects that's out there, where does this fall at in this equation? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator. So our study has a pretty broad public involvement component, and obviously, having a document out there that's already taken a look at some of these issues is going to be a part of it. I think the BRTB committed a significant portion of this year's planning dollars to this, and I think we'll be lucky enough to go into a lot of detail and actually start pulling the financial numbers and driving it. But the study certainly lines up with what we had in our scope of work, so obviously there'll be some overlap. But I think it's just a question of detail and having, in our case, the resources to dive into exactly what some of these numbers look like and what some of the outcomes might look like. I will defer on the other projects. I'll just defer on the Maglev and other things.
Mr. Chair, maybe could I speak to the second question about the private sector? I'd say it's great to have options, and it's great to have different technologies out there. In my work, we often get asked about Maglev and Hyperloop because those are, in my opinion, kind of bright, shiny objects that get in the paper and people get excited about. But I always remind folks that those are technologies, and we're looking to improve outcomes for the people and employers of the region. And so there's a way of going about that involves planning and setting goals. For example, Maglev is a solution for travel between Baltimore and Washington. So we should look at that corridor and what we're trying to accomplish as a state to move people between Baltimore and Washington in terms of speed, in terms of cost, in terms of environmental impact, and figure out what's the best technology to do that for the taxpayer, for whatever public resources are being asked. If they can do it privately without any public involvement, then more power to them. But if they need public involvement, then we should be asking hard questions about what public purpose this is serving. And so I get worried when we get the solution in search of a problem, or we get a technology before we have defined a corridor and looked at what we need. So that's what I would say about that.
I can add on really quickly, actually, to that. I can't speak very directly to Maglev or any specific project proposals, but several years ago, ENO had a report specifically on contracting. It's not one of the reports that was in the slide that I showed, but we looked at contracting for transit operations specifically, and I think it can play a role. I think the underlying point, though, is that you can't contract out the public interest. So if anybody's looking for more information on that, I think our a report from 2016 or 17, it was fairly recently, is a good source for that.
Thank you. Delegate Kittleman. You have to unmute, Delegate Kittleman.
I'm sorry, I generally remember that. I just wanted to first thank you, Chairman Corman and Delegate Bridges. I think this is a study that is, I won't say long overdue, but I'm delighted that it's happening because obviously there are a number of issues. I have a few questions, so if I go too long, just cut me off and I'll come back at the end, hopefully. One of the ones that I wanted to ask from the most recent speaker, Paul, I think that was you. You talk about a local assessment for raising funds. Would that consider not just how many people they had, but how much transit they used? I didn't hear you say that, and I wondered if that's the case.
Yeah, so I mean, you could structure an assessment however you want. We were using the example in Boston. The MBTA assesses the 175 cities and towns in and around the city an annual fee to boost up some of their operating fundings based on population. So that jurisdiction's share of the regional population is how they do it there.
Way back when the WMATA first began, Montgomery County and Prince George's each contributed an amount that equaled 25% of the cost of WMATA, because they are pretty much the ones that used it. That went by the boards, but I think having locals participate is a good idea. When you talk about looking at how things are structured, and are you going to take a hard look at the MTA internal workings? I don't know exactly if it's gotten any better since I was involved a number of years ago, but we found that the MTA itself really is pretty much handcuffed by a union contract that is arcane, to say the least, and it creates a number of very strange outcomes that cost money that probably hinders our ability to really, maximize the value of that. Just on a side note, Paul, I wanted to agree with you when you say that there is a lack of consistency, that governors, I'm sorry, something rang in my house.
You're
When they
timing your
try
own
to-
questions.
That's right. Apparently I am. That they change things. I remember when I became deputy secretary, I made a number of speeches, and what I said in all of them was, and I quote, "The first thing that Secretary Flanagan did when he got into his office was pick up the key, go down into the cellar, and unlock the SHA." And there really is a difference in approach. It took 50 years or more to get the intercounty connector built, and I know that some of the transit projects are having the same issue. So I don't know if you're going to look into the union contract. I don't know, what that would entail, but I would say that it's something worth at least looking at. The entities that you suggest creating, the three options, I wonder, it sounds as though they will be empowered to make decisions, but without the obligation to raise the funds to fund their decisions. And is that the case?
I think each option is a little bit different, right? So the first option is basically advisory board, so that they certainly wouldn't have the authority to raise funds. The second option would kind of work with the existing budget, and so they would work with the state, and those would be governor appointees, so it would still be state controlled. The third option would, I think, perhaps have the ability to raise its own funds through local options, or and those kind of things. The local participation on the board, I think, would be crucial for making that happen.
Yeah, as deeming it an authority that suggests that it should be able to, because the school system sometimes is frustrating, having the option to set the budgets, but not the responsibility of raising the funds. The last thing I wanted to ask is, I was not at all surprised that during this pandemic, the transit that continued the most was the Baltimore Bus System. And I agree with that. And I always like to say that buses have to ride on roads. And unfortunately, I don't think that we are in charge, we as the state, in charge of the roads in Baltimore City. So that's sort of a disconnect. But that is where I always saw the need to be is for the internal going into the city. And I had a question, do we have at this point a system that shows people who are at a bus stop when that next bus is due, and not due, but when is it actually going to get there? I mean, they have that in London, I'm sure a lot of other places, and it was something that we tried desperately to accomplish and were unsuccessful. And I just wondered if we'd done that yet. Does anybody?
I can speak to that, Kittleman. I think the best answer to that is on people's smartphone, the transit app, which the MTA is sponsored with. The MTA's part in that was putting technology on the buses that provided a reliable signal where they're located. For the longest time, you couldn't get a reliable signal of where a bus was. And so adding that GPS unit on the buses fleet-wide makes that transit app a great tool. I was involved when I first joined the Transportation Alliance. We made a big push in like 2008 and 9 to try to get those LED signs like you're describing. The problem was power supply to every bus stop. And we worked with BGE, but it's a big cost, and it just wasn't feasible. There's so many bus stops in a system that it wasn't feasible. So it works great on like subway platforms, but it's harder to do on every single bus stop.
So if someone is standing at a bus stop and they have a phone and they look at it, it will tell them that their bus is at XYZ, but not exactly how many minutes it would take. You would have to estimate that, which I assume that people who rode it regularly could do.
The transit app tells you how many minutes. So it tells you the number or the route of the bus that's approaching and the number of minutes. And so you can see the countdown as it gets closer to your stop.
Super. And the only other question I have is, have we looked to see, I know cell phones are everywhere, but I wonder if everyone in the city who rides buses to get to work has access, has a cell phone that they can use to do that. It's just something I think would be interesting to find out in pursuit of equity. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Kittleman. Perhaps we should have warned our ENO guest that you are former Deputy Secretary Kittleman as well. Delegate Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for your presentations today as well. I think when I put my bill in last year, it was sort of a modest budget, modest bill that obviously wouldn't have gotten as much out of it as we're getting now today with the ENO report, as well as the 300+ report that's going to be commenced by the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. So I definitely appreciate you all being on here today. Just want to sort of follow up, and if I get too much in the weeds, you all please let me know. But I wanted to follow up with the ENO study and ask a few questions about that because I think it really does give sort of a precursor to what could happen with the study that Baltimore Metropolitan Council is about to do. But in terms of the funding, I noticed that your target of $140 million focused really on Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And I was wondering, how does that sort of that split if you start adding other counties, let's say Anne Arundel County is involved or Howard County, how would that split actually happen? And the other question, as you think about that though, is a phasing. And so let's say we do go with an authority or an oversight or some board, and you also change the funding structure. How do you see that being phased in over time to get to that 140 million that you discussed in the study?
I can start in a response pretty high level. So thank you for the question, Delegate Bridges. And if anybody has the report in front of them, the number that he was referring to is on page 39. We have kind of a call out box. This is simply illustrative. So we used Baltimore City and County as the examples here because that's where the primary service is. I think that number would change though, depending on other jurisdictions that come in, right? So the idea is that, if Anne Arundel or other jurisdictions want to participate, the ultimate mix of funding would differ. Paul probably has some added thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, and to Brian's point, we chose those two just because that's where the bulk of the service is. I think ideally it would expand and have more of the suburban jurisdictions join in part because it's crucial that the region kind of function as that, right? A transportation system doesn't end at borders. And there's probably a lot of investments we could be making in both the city and in the surrounding jurisdictions to expand that access. And the more that participate, the easier that it is going to be to raise those funds.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, if I can, another question. In terms of raising funds and looking at the different structures, one of the things that I was interested in, and this came to mind as we were talking, so let's say there's an authority that's established. Would there be a sort of, would they have the ability to have bonding authority, as an example, which, could also assist them? Because I know we mentioned the sales tax and other fees. Is a bonding authority sort of an example that we can also look at for the new creation? And the other question is, as you look at the different peer agencies, is there one that you will hold up as the model that you would see does it better than anybody else? I've often heard of Massachusetts being that model, but maybe that's not the one that we really need to look to as much. So those are my questions for you.
Yeah, so I'll answer your second question first. In terms of the, is there kind of a model that is perfect? And I would say absolutely not. Every region has its own jurisdictional issues, its own history, its own systemic problems that face the region, and those have to be addressed one-on with governance, right? And so the slide that I had a few ago that kind of talked about those broad principles about state involvement, local involvement, consistency. I mean, those are the kind of factors that go into making good governance. But the specific model really is kind of it's specific to each region, and it's also kind of a result of political compromise to make that happen. And now I'm forgetting the first half of your question.
It was about bonding authority.
Right.
Just trying to think outside the box.
Yeah, so a lot of authorities have bonding authority, but not all of them. And so that's a kind of a decision that the state can and should make when creating the legislation that would authorize this local authority as to whether that's a power you'd like to be able to give this entity.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Bridges. Vice Chair Krim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to tell the representatives from the Eno Center that you did a fabulous job. We read your report, and I think you were spot on in how the structure works for MDOT and how we're funded in Maryland. So I would suggest to Mr. Kelly when he's doing his report that don't spend any time writing that, just do a cut and paste, because I think they know exactly, and they studied it, and it was an excellent representation. So I would refer anybody who's wondering how we work in Maryland for transportation and how it's funded, they just read that report. That would explain that. My question is for Mr. Kelly, though, and I don't know whether he knows this or not. There's been some discussion at the federal level, about an infrastructure bill. So would the red line be in a position to take federal funding? Or is that still up to speed in terms of the EIS? It is not. You're shaking your head. Okay.
No, we would, to get federal funding through any of the federal grant programs, we would have to start at the back of the line for a brand new project. And there's all sorts of reasons why for the red line, but essentially once the cancellation happened, that project as designed was not going to be built again.
Okay. Do you know if there was any property acquired for the red line? Is that still intact or?
The properties acquired are not all intact, no.
Okay. All right. That answers my question. Okay. I have one more question, Mr. Chairman. Also, this is for you, Mr. Kelly. I think that we all understand that this is going to come down to a funding issue. And I know that you said in your testimony that your report is not going to recommend a funding structure. Will you consider doing a poll as to what funding options are available and ask the public what they would like to see? The Northern Virginia model is one, and they did a referendum, and now they have this funding source for Northern Virginia. So if it was a dedicated funding source, that would be one, of course. And then, you could put others on there like VMT, et cetera, gas tax, whatever. So would you consider doing that? Because it would just give us some direction. It would tell us what the public's thinking a little bit. So thank you. Those are my
Currently,
questions.
that's not part of the outreach strategy. I don't know if we've ever polled issues before. I would imagine once this comes out, somebody will do a poll, and that information will certainly get out there. But there will be a significant public involvement component of what we're doing. But polling hasn't been considered as part of it. I'm not sure that's with federal funds is something we could do either.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Delegate Beitzel.
There we go. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted? Okay, I see a shake of head. Okay, thanks. I have a couple questions. Maybe the first one, any of the panel can answer it, but maybe I think the issue came up when Brian O'Malley was speaking. One of the problems before COVID came along was that riders, even though we're putting more money, allocating more funds, giving more attention to mass transit systems, the ridership seems to continue to decline. And of course, during now this pandemic situation, as we've seen some forms of transportation, like the airport went down 90% for a time. But the money continues to come out of the Maryland, the Transportation Trust Fund. But I guess the first question would be, the reasons for the decline in ridership? Is it crime? Is it inconvenience? Is it the safety of the system? I know there was a major accident on WMATA that seemed to cause a real problem for ridership but that's being addressed. So what are the reasons, even before COVID, that the system ridership is declining?
I'm happy to answer first. One thing, if you look at transit ridership over decades, it tracks with the price of gas. So in 2009, transit ridership peaked when gas was hitting $4 a gallon. So over time, you can look at the relative cost of driving to look at that. But in the Baltimore region, our region has evolved and our system has not. And I'm not sure that the system has been adequately funded, certainly not in an expansion level. And the needs of the residents when the system was designed are not the same transportation needs that we have now. It's not we haven't put things off as much as the DC region did in terms of maintenance, but that's certainly part of it. Around the country, you see more and more desire in metro areas and urban areas for transit. I don't think we lack that desire in and around Baltimore, but it's not a system that gets people to the places they want to go as much. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, a comment that I agree with you. There seems to be more and more of a desire, and we see it particularly in central Maryland, for more transit systems. And depending on it, we see the expansion of the blue line. We talk about the red line. But even in the blue line, unfortunately now, I guess we've worked out the problems there and the construction will proceed. But when it comes online, it's not going to be self-sufficient. There'll be more money, a requirement to come from the Transportation Trust Fund. And so even though the desire is there, the revenue is not being generated to cover those costs. So more comes out of the Transportation Trust Fund. And so it brings me to my second question, the highway user revenue. As we know, for 60 years, there was a distribution of about 30% of that to all local jurisdictions, and they could decide basically how they were going to use that revenue in their jurisdictions. As we know, that was cut, that 30% was cut clear back by 90%, back to about 10%. There's been some of that's been restored. But what I'm hearing in a rural area where our choices of transportation are walking, the bicycle, the horse, and the automobile, or some vehicle. That's about it. We don't have any transportation systems at all. But we see our funds keep getting cut, and the choice and more of that's going to be taken away. So we're hearing, I think Senator Edwards and I, and he can attest that we're hearing from our people and our local governments that, hey, what's going, we're getting cut, and so what's going to happen is these mass transit systems expand, and it's refreshing to see that you had recommendations to have some local options or decisions that more the area that's providing the transportation systems raise some money themselves. And we've been encouraging that, obviously. But since you made no recommendation, as Delegate Krimis suggested, where do you see the highway user revenue, and where do you see those of us in rural Maryland areas going if this trend continues to take more and more money from the revenue source that we currently have and put into mass transit, and where does that leave us?
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll take a stab at responding to that.
Yeah, I mean, also just Delegate Beitzel, for context here, these folks are putting together a particular study about MTA and MTA advocacy. So I just want to make sure we're not asking them questions that are really outside their lane. But Mr. O'Malley, if you want to give it a ride, please go ahead.
Well, I think to your first question, I think a big reason for the decline in ridership, I remember whenever we get into conversations about funding and ridership and who rides what mode, it's kind of a chicken and egg argument. I remember when Secretary Ron came as a guest, he was a brand new as Maryland Secretary, he came as a guest to my board of directors. He told us, there will be a shift to roads. And there was, and we've seen an increase in the amount Marylanders drive each of us drives more now. And that, that was a choice. That's a decision based on putting more money towards roads and highways and less money towards transit. At the federal level for decades, we've had a mandate that we put 80% of federal subsidies towards roads and highways and 20% towards transit. The Baltimore Regional Transit Board just passed a 4-year spending program where they're going to spend 650 times more on new highway capacity than on new transit capacity. So we are, in effect, causing lower transit ridership and more driving per capita. We're causing the traffic by choices we're making. The cost of that to us is time spent in traffic, air pollution, and things spreading out. Land use wise, it gets harder and harder to connect people to where they need to get to. And then as far as the I think the transportation, no mode. Let me say this: cars and highways are not paying their own way. No transit user is subsidizing other transit users through generating a profit. Everybody is getting subsidized at the federal and state level by adding things from the corporate income tax, the sales tax, and so forth, property tax, and at the local level. So none of us is paying so much through user fees, whether it's gas tax or tolls or transit fares. that we're generating a profit that is then being used to subsidize somebody else. We're all being subsidized by the collection of these revenues at the state and federal level. The U.S. Highway Trust Fund has not been solvent for years. The Maryland Transportation Trust Fund is getting help from corporate income tax and sales tax and so forth. So I would respond with those points.
Thank you.
And Delegate Beitzel, offline, I'll give you the WMATA ridership history, which was actually up in 2019 and the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic hit. Second bite at the apple, Delegate Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging. And thank you also, colleagues, for indulging me. This is obviously very, very important to me in terms of looking at, the financing as well as the oversight for the MTA. And so I just have two last questions. Obviously, and it was mentioned earlier about the fact that in Baltimore City, the greater Baltimore community relies heavily on public transportation. As was noted, when COVID hit, there may have been a dip, but that dip did not stay that way for ridership in terms of those that were on the bus in Baltimore City. And so Baltimore City, Baltimore County. And so one of the questions that I had in terms of looking specifically at the peer agencies, when you talk about ridership for those peer agencies, are you also looking at like employment as well as a breakdown of race for the individuals that are considered our peer agencies in terms of the bus ridership? And the second question was something related to something that Delegate Krim brought up, and that's in terms of communicating with the public. And so I know as the study is going forward for the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, there's should be an opportunity for the general public to maybe weigh in or learn a little bit more about what's going on. And so, Mike, if you could talk a little bit more about how you plan on making sure that the general public is just aware of the study and the things that you're trying to accomplish with the study. So those are my last two questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right, sure. Thanks, Delegate. The on the public involvement piece, we have so our first official public interaction with the consultant team helping us is on Tuesday. There's going to be a public outreach plan developed for this study. We are going to try and figure out how to do, typically public outreach for a study of this scope would involve a lot of big in-person meetings. It could involve people standing by transit stops doing surveys of riders. There's all sorts of things that a pandemic does not allow. So first and foremost, I think for what we're doing, stakeholder groups are going to be critical. We're expecting our staff and our consultant team to set up a series of sort of high-level informed stakeholders to help drive this. And then we're going to talk about the best possible ways during this pandemic. We're probably not all vaccinated by June, so we're going to have to find ways to reach people where they are and get input from the general public on what we're doing. With regard to how we're going to approach peer agencies, I think the first thing you do is look at similar modes and you look at ridership numbers in the size of the system. But beyond that, the points you looked upon, the type of trip taken, whether it's for work, for school, for other reasons, and then the demographics of the people using the service, it obviously is something we have to consider. There are, and I don't want to sort of preempt anything about our study or put my finger on the scale, but there are models around the country whose numbers line up exactly like Baltimore's, but the demographics of the riders may not. So I think we're going to look at all of it and try and find some systems that we can really learn from. And there's not a system in the country that's like ours. So we're going to have to cast a wide net and look at a lot of options.
Okay, I think I might get the last question. I have a little bit of a sense of deja vu, and it's slightly referenced in the report, but in 2016, we passed legislation creating I think we called it a planning and oversight board, oversight and planning board, something like that for MTA. I know, looked at it. I know Brian's very familiar with it, but what was wrong there when it was vetoed and, never enacted that we could do differently if that's the option that was pursued, by the General Assembly in the future? What was the problem with that approach that's not currently in operation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We did kind of model that option after that legislation. We thought that it was a compelling idea, something that clearly had some political traction. I guess the differential we would make would be to create, instead of one, we would make three, and not to make more bureaucracy, but more to focus on the three core functions that MTA has. So one would be comprised of local officials focused on the transit in and around Baltimore. The second one would be on the statewide commuter services. So that would bring in folks from all over the state that rely on those commuter services to get to DC, to get to Baltimore, to kind of travel across bridges and those kind of things. And then the last one focused on the capital construction and provide some oversight and some guidance on those big capital projects like the Purple Line.
Great. Thank you. And Ina, do you want to plug your webinar as long as we're here before we go?
Yeah, sure thing. I will find a link for that and send that as well. But we are hosting a webinar next Wednesday, I think, at 4 o'clock with, we've invited speakers from the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Boston region to talk about, recent and ongoing, actually in the case of the Twin Cities, governance reform efforts in those two places. So I think that'll be a good opportunity to get into some more detail for each of those places.
Great. Well, thank you to all our panelists and the subcommittee members and all our guests. I thought it was a good conversation with a lot of great questions. We appreciate your presentations. And obviously the discussion will continue. Delegate Bridges will make sure of that. With that, I believe we are adjourned. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.